So we've looked at the iPhone 7 Plus and the Galaxy S7 Edge for stills, but who's the king when it comes to video? Welcome to Byte Review. Join me today as we compare the iPhone 7 Plus against the Galaxy S7 Edge. Before we get started, let's quickly run those specs. The iPhone 7 Plus has a 12 megapixel main sensor and an aperture stop of f1.8 with optical image stabilization and a front-facing 7 megapixel camera, while the Galaxy is rocking a 12 megapixel main sensor, which also includes OIS and a 5 megapixel front-facing camera. Also, in terms of fairness, I've tried to use a tripod where I can, or film both simultaneously. Both cameras have also been left on full auto mode. I'm going to cover everything I think is worth looking at in terms of video modes on a phone, so that includes standard 1080p footage, autofocus performance, selfie or vlog modes, slow motion, time-lapse and finally 4K footage too. Let's get started with the most basic video recording, unstabilized standard 1080p. This is some walking footage, and as you can see the iPhone does a pretty good job at stabilizing out handheld shots, keeping things relatively smooth while keeping focus on the subject quite well. If you look hard enough you can see it kick the refocus very occasionally, but it's not overly noticeable. It's exposed rather well and the colours are looking nice and punchy too. Switching to the Samsung, you might notice the biggest differences in colour and exposure. Things appear quite a lot darker here, which is interesting as Samsung's cameras generally have more punch and brightness when it comes to stills. Despite that, the stabilisation is doing a good job like the iPhone, and there is less refocusing, which makes the image a little more stable. Side by side, it's a lot easier to see the colour and brightness difference between the two. Let's look at some stabilised shots now, and by stabilised I mean I too was on a skateboard. This time round the iPhone does a much better job of keeping focus. There's pretty much no refocusing during the clip, which is great to see. What's worth noting is how well the iPhone readjusts itself for best exposure too. It's generally very quick and keeps everything nice and viewable. The dynamic range shines here from the iPhone as well. The sky is kept blue and the ground looks nice and dark. Again, this is the biggest difference between the two. Switching to the Galaxy you can see the sky is a lot more flat and there's very little blue to speak of. The overall exposure is a little dark as well, which is a bit of a shame. Despite that, it still keeps focus just as well and there is no sign of any refocusing either, which is great to see. Like before, this is easier to see when both are side by side. The iPhone definitely has a better dynamic range than the Samsung and the colours seem a little more punched up, which I really like. They both have excellent stabilisation however, but I think in terms of colour and dynamic range alone, this one goes to the iPhone. Moving over to autofocus now, and I'll just say it, both phones are near identical in terms of autofocus speed and transition. They're both wickedly quick and move between focus points smoothly. There really isn't much else to say here, so for this category they're both winners. Now the selfie or vlog mode or whatever you want to call it is where things start to get interesting. Starting with the iPhone again, you can see straight off the bat that the footage is really rather unsteady, and after a few seconds of the footage it isn't particularly nice to watch. The colours and wideness are here in abundance, but with footage this unstable it's hard to recommend the iPhone for front-facing videos. That comes in stark contrast to the S7, which is way more stable. It actually looks like there's some stabilisation going on, but I couldn't find any specs to back that up. Either way, the footage from the S7 looks way better. Again, the colours don't pop quite as much as the iPhone, but it's actually kept more of the sky exposed. But for the stabilisation alone, the S7 is the winner here. On top of that, the S7 can also record in 2K using the front-facing camera, if you should ever wish to use that. So if you're a vlogger or plan on using the front-facing camera for a lot of video, the S7 is a very clear choice here. In terms of slow-mo, the iPhone has always been the phone to get, and I think that still holds true today. First up, the iPhone has two modes for slow motion, 120 frames per second, which can be recorded in full HD at 1080, which is what you're watching now, and 240 frames per second at 720 if you fancy going extra slow. That 240 FPS footage shows clear signs of a quality drop though, and while that might be fine for a social media share, I wouldn't really recommend it for anything else. Unfortunately, the S7 only records at 240 frames per second at 720, which results in lower quality footage, and while it's still not bad, it's still not quite as good as the iPhone. The colours are a lot more washed out. Take a look at these black jeans while the clips are side by side. The winner has to be the iPhone here. Having two modes and one that records in full HD makes the phone a lot more suited for that slow motion video. Timelapse was another interesting one. For this test, both phones were left on the same tripod for a full 8 minutes. However, they both resulted in pretty different results. The iPhone managed to pull a 30-second time-lapse out of the bag, while the Samsung only pulled 8 seconds. The resulting footage on the Samsung is way quicker than the iPhone, which isn't a bad thing, and that comes down to more personal preference. However, the iPhone still pulls a better dynamic range than the Samsung. Personally, I prefer the slower time-lapse from the iPhone here, but like I said, it is down to personal preference on this one. Last up, we've got some 4K footage, and there's some big differences here. Kicking off with the iPhone, we can see the image appears pretty well balanced, but it has suffered a little bit from the wind speed. Look at the anchor at the top left of the image. You can see the iPhone almost wobbles a little bit in the wind. You'd be hard pushed to see it zoomed out, but it is there. That aside, the overall image quality is pretty darn decent. Moving to the S7, and you can see the colour difference here is pretty huge. The shadows are now really noticeable, and the blue of the sea has completely changed. Zooming in, you can see that the S7 did better against the wind with no wobbling like the iPhone had. Putting them against each other, I wouldn't say either one is worse than the other here. They're both excellently detailed, it just comes down to which colour you prefer. Personally, I think the iPhone footage is a little bit more usable off the bat. So that's pretty much all the modes covered. I've given you my opinion on each, so I'm not declaring a winner as such. You can make up your own mind about which one you prefer. I would say the S7 makes more sense for vloggers with the front-facing camera stabilization, but the iPhone easily beats it in terms of slow motion and dynamic range performance. Regardless of which one you think is better, it's fair to say whichever one you get, you'll be pretty happy with the results. They are phones after all. It's also worth me mentioning that the S7 does have a range of pro features built into the camera app, so if you're savvy enough, you can pretty much change anything about it, including the pulling of focus, which is pretty awesome. Anyway, that's all from me. If you enjoyed this video, then drop a like and take a look at my still photo comparison, which you can find here. Thanks for watching this video. I've been Tom, and I will see you all in the next one.